Okay, the joining ticker has slowed down, so we'll make a start. So welcome everybody to this year's fourth and final Bartlett School of Planning public lecture. My name's Nick Gallant, and I'm a professor here at UCL, and I shall be chairing this evening's event. Tonight's event is our special lecture, named in honour of our much missed colleague, Sir Peter Hall. Peter's work on cities and regions is known globally and continues to be highly influential in the fields of public policy and practice. But at PSP, Peter is remembered as a mentor, an inspiration, and as a friend to all of us. We use this occasion each year both to remember Peter and his enormous contribution to academic and public debates, and to bring a leading international researcher or practitioner before an audience of colleagues, students, and guests to speak on a topic that we believe resonates with Peter's work. Tonight's Peter Hall lecture is the culmination of this year's public lecture programme, which began in October with the talk from our own John Tominey, who examined the challenges facing left behind places using an in-depth case study in County Durham. Then in January, we hosted Maria Adebowale-Schwarter from the Foundation for Future London, who spoke on the subject of placemaking and philanthropy. A third lecture was delivered in March by Professors Isabel Angelovsky and James Connolly on the inequitable outcomes of poorly designed urban greening programs. One of the advantages of running a lecture series like this is that it's a lot easier to record the events. So our back catalogue for this year and for previous years is available on our website. And the website also has details of forthcoming events, both this public lecture series and other events that we run in the Bartlett School of Planning. And we'll be announcing the lineup of speakers for next year very, very shortly. Let me now introduce our speaker for this evening. Sharon Zukin is Professor Emerita of Sociology and of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is author of the classic study, Loft Living, Culture and Capital in Urban Change, and other books about the contemporary urban experience, from Cultures of Cities to Naked City, the Death and Life of Authentic Urban Places. Her book, Landscapes of Power from Detroit to Disney World, won the C. Wright Mills Award. Naked City won the Jane Jacobs Award for Urban Communication. And Professor Zukin received the Robert and Helen Lind Award for Career Achievement in Urban Sociology. Her latest book is titled The Innovation Complex, Cities, Tech, and the New Economy. And that was published by Oxford University 2 years ago. Tonight, she'll draw on the research behind the innovation complex and speak on the subject of placemaking in the metaverse, from innovation districts to crypto cities. There'll of course be an opportunity at the end to ask questions. You can either type them into the Q&A or possibly, if the technology allows, we'll be able to unmute you and allow you to ask the questions yourself. So without further ado, Sharon has appeared on screen. Welcome to UCL virtually, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nick. And thanks to all of my colleagues at the Bartlett School for inviting me to give the Sir Peter Hall lecture for this year. I'm appreciative of the honor. Sir Peter Hall had a stature in the field and an understanding of cities that one can only hope to follow. And although I probably would disagree with him on enterprise zones and technopoles, I am greatly appreciative of his work. I thought I would speak about the metaverse as a way of extending the research that I wrote about in my book, The Innovation Complex. So I am just walking through the metaverse and sharing with you some preliminary observations that anyone might make thinking about this newest trend in digital technology. If I had begun to speak to you 2 months ago, you would have thought, boy, she's a genius and she must be making a lot of money. But since stock markets have gone down and venture capitalists are warning startups to cut back on burning cash, and even Sequoia, one of the largest venture capital firms in the US and the world, has alerted everyone to this as a crucible moment, you might think that this is a finished topic and there's really nothing to speak about. But I think that the metaverse is with us for some time, and I think it's going to be a subject of enormous questioning and controversy. So what exactly is it? It's an assemblage, like many other digital technology phenomena of the past 40 years, that combines new technology, new financial instruments, and new user experiences. It's not just one of these things, but it's all three of them wrapped up, led by some of the most prominent faces of the metaverse, particularly certain forms of cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, organizations like DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations that seem new because they're not the same as corporations, but corporations, starting with the big technology firms, appear in this assemblage also, and are leading the movement forward, even though this seems to be a dramatically new set of instruments and events. I'm particularly interested in the expansion of the speculative mentality that began, on the one hand, with the entrepreneurial self that's identified with the dawn of neoliberalism in the 1970s and 80s, and also with the entrepreneurial cities that people have written about in the same period of time, that have become more speculative over the years as city governments invest in digital technology and combine with big tech companies to aid a tech-driven vision of urban growth. I follow in the footsteps of British geographers who have been writing about these phenomena for the past 20 years, particularly Andrew Leishon and Nigel Thrift, who wrote about tech companies' search for spaces that can yield new dividends in the early 2000s, just before the 2008 financial crisis, and also expressed, in the words of a journalist for Vice Media, as a super financialized world where everything and every action is monetized on an individual level. And again, I put all of these together in words that other people use to promote them: the metaverse, or in my words, a digital fix. But it's real. And I like to use the New York subway system as an index of reality. So you can even see in the advertisements this week in the subway trains that people are talking about crypto. So I assume that the investment startup that placed these advertisements the length of the subway car believes that a lot of people in New York City, including subway riders, are talking about crypto. It is real in terms of money, despite the setbacks of cryptocurrency in the past few weeks. and of the warnings of venture capitalists, the amount of money that is being invested still in blockchain and crypto and NFTs and all the metaverse products is increasing. The venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, for example, recently raised $4.5 billion for a cryptocurrency fund. It's the largest cryptocurrency venture capital fund in the sector. An Israeli startup in blockchain technology raised $100 million in a Series D round of investment. And that company, that startup, is valued at $8 billion. So to be crass about it, the money says it's real. And so do the subway advertisements. Just like this month, a company whose main product seems to be totally ridiculous images of monkeys raised a huge amount of money by selling another kind of metaverse product, land or real estate in a virtual world. So even though there are these crazy things going on, at least from an ordinary person's point of view, crypto and blockchain and NFTs and the whole metaverse are becoming not only real, but becoming in some ways respectable. So that at one of the recent conferences to promote the metaverse, we can see people whom we know on the platform talking about this stuff. We can see the leader of a respectable country that wants to become involved not only in hosting these conferences, but also in being a production site for some of the financial transactions involved. And we see kind of a youngish entrepreneur from an emerging market economy who is also trying to tie his investment, the funds that are available to him and his country, to this global assemblage. And if you missed the conference in the Bahamas, you can quickly find another one. Architects, since I hope I have some architects and architecture professors in the audience, architects are also looking to make a place for themselves in the metaverse. Bjork Ingels Group has designed an office for Vice Media. Another office called Roar has designed an office for itself in the metaverse. And one of the biggest global architectural firms has got involved in a big urban plan for a real space, not only a virtual space, but a real space in Liberland, which is a small border region in far Eastern Europe. So with Zaha Hadid's firm in mind and looking at their design, I'd like to ask Vicki Howard to show a video that I made just before the COVID pandemic reached New York to understand how like and unlike these representations of the metaverse are compared to the tech economy that we know in, say, New York. Vicki, could you show the video, please? Hi, I'm Sharon Zukin. I want to show you New York's innovation complex. New York's wealth has always been rooted in its waterfront. In the old days, the wealth came from trade, with docks and warehouses as the physical connectors between the city and the world economy. Today, a growing portion of the city's wealth comes from tech production for digital media, business software, and online shopping. Tech and creative offices are the new connectors to the global economy. They make up an innovation complex and also a new landscape of power. During the dot-com boom of the 1990s, new media companies clustered along Broadway from 23rd Street to Wall Street. The skyscraper canyon of Broadway got a new name, Silicon Alley. But this early tech economy suffered a series of nasty shocks. The dot-com stock crash in 2000-2001, the 9/11 World Trade Center attack, and the 2008 financial crisis. After the crisis, with new software and mobile technology, startups began to grow in New York's industries. These startups attracted venture capitalists and investment banks. And the New York City Economic Development Corporation staked out a strategy to make New York a technology center. Real estate developers were eager to fill office buildings that had been emptied by the 2008 financial crisis, as well as millions of square feet of new office development, starting with the World Trade Center. Companies benefited from subsidies to rebuild the district after 9/11. Media and tech firms like Condé Nast and Spotify moved into the new World Trade Center. Financial companies hired thousands of engineers to develop fintech. Wall Street is now a tech and media hub. Google has a big presence along the waterfront in Chelsea. They opened their first New York office in the early 2000s with one marketing employee. Now they have 7,000 people working in 5 buildings, starting with the old Nabisco Bakery building near the High Line. Think of it as a move from chocolate chips to silicon chips, although of course the chips are not manufactured here. This was a good moment for the area. In 2006, construction on the High Line had just begun, and a special zoning district connected its financing to real estate developers. Google now has 3 million square feet here, including YouTube production studios in the Chelsea Market building and offices in the old Port Authority headquarters. And they're expanding to a new campus west of Soho. In 2014, the northern end of the High Line opened, creating a pathway from Google to Hudson Yards. Most people know Hudson Yards for luxury housing, restaurants, and shopping, but it is also part of the innovation complex, where new corporate offices meld big tech and the city's biggest financial firms. BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Wells Fargo have offices here. So do Time Warner, HBO, Alphabet's Sidewalk Labs, and the German software company SAP. Facebook has leased more than 1 million square feet at Hudson Yards. And Amazon? Well, it's around the corner. On the East River waterfront, another important part of the ecosystem has developed. Cornell Tech, a partnership between Cornell University and Israel Institute of Technology, was initiated by the city government in 2010 after the financial crisis. It's a graduate school to train elite software engineers, app developers, and business students. The idea is that they will create startups in New York or get good jobs with the city's major tech employers and financial firms. Cornell Tech brings students and professors into collaborations with businesses. That's how the school, like the city's other universities, encourages innovation and entrepreneurship and capitalizes on faculty and student startups. Another short ferry ride away, the Brooklyn waterfront has gradually emerged as New York's new media and manufacturing district. Dot-com firms started out here in the 90s, in Dumbo's old warehouses and factories. By the early 2000s, digital branding firms, media artists, and other startups formed a tech and creative hub. At the same time, the Brooklyn Navy Yard went through a transformation. In 2004, Steiner Studios for film and TV production opened there. This was the first large-scale production space to come along after the last shipbuilders moved out. Steiner Studios anchored the reimagining of the Navy Yard as a part of the city's new economy. In the 2010s, the Navy Yard signed with a real estate developer to create New Lab, an accelerator, incubator, and workspace for both hardware and software startups. The Navy Yard is one of the few places in the tech ecosystem that integrates manufacturing and tech offices, and a venture capitalist's office too. More than 100 startups work side by side at New Lab and connect to potential investors. Other startups are working with urban agriculture, transportation, and alternative energy. One company here designed this robotic coffee maker. Cool technology, but no baristas. The Brooklyn Navy Yard complex represents the best vision for now of what the ecosystem can become. Traditional manufacturing, new manufacturing, urban transportation, and urban farms. This is New York's new economy. Yet its future depends on continued real estate development, tech job growth, and city government support. Not an easy combination. Thank you. So it looks as though the materiality of the tech landscape in New York is very much dependent on old industrial buildings and a bit of new construction and kind of a traditional form of boat transportation. But in many ways, it looks like this, where you have perhaps different shaped buildings, but the same sort of imagining of functional areas. And in fact, it even looks like this, which I claim no credit for myself because it's a construction of found materials made by a Congolese artist named Isaac Bodis Kingelez a few years ago. So our imagining of the metaverse might not be so different from what actually exists today. The metaverse then is a bunch of socio-technical practices, including blockchain and other technologies, a set of visual representations that can be designed in the form of individual buildings, functionally differentiated, and clusters of these buildings in an urban plan. But the metaverse that I wrote about in my book, and that interests my book on the tech economy, and that still interests me, is an economic field where we have discourse, we have organizations, and we have geographies that work together to create a new economy, a new way of looking at the world, a new experience of the world that results in very similar sets of haves and have-nots. So what's most interesting for me about the metaverse is that it's a fictitious landscape of capitalism going into the 2020s. Of course, there's a material base that constructs this landscape, and there are different companies, including big tech, hardware and software companies, building the basic infrastructure. There are slightly smaller companies and startups building all of the specialized hardware and the other kinds of tools that are needed going into software to create the new products and to create marketplaces, I should say, for the new products, and to create experiences that hook people into believing in the metaverse and participating in the world that it sets before us. What these companies do is they create financial value by creating uses for the new technologies, and they link users to the technologies by creating apps. This is what's been done since the software revolution of the early 2000s, but perhaps moving into a more virtual dimension. What is also interesting is that through the speculative mentality that has become so widespread with metaverse discourse, new groups of investors are being created. Of course, there are corporate venture capital funds, including Google's and Amazon's, that are extremely active in funding metaverse startups. And then there are the startups themselves, some of which, Coinbase, for example, a marketplace for cryptocurrency, invest in other startups, which is kind of a new phenomenon in tech investment. And then there are the content creators, graphic artists, photographers, painters, sculptors, even street artists, who are attracted to creating NFTs of their work, with the idea that this will enable them to be financially rewarded on a longer term basis and in greater volume than has been possible so far. And then there are the wage workers who, at least discursively on the part of some of the promoters and evangelists of the metaverse, the wage workers who might be paid or might be persuaded to accept some of their salaries in the form of NFTs, an extremely risky idea. But it's an idea that is promoted heavily by the sort of culture that the evangelists and promoters from different fields are creating. They both feature the jealousy targets of big musicians and popular artists who have sold their NFTs for a lot of money, and they position ordinary creators in opposition to those big performers by telling them that with NFTs, they could get much better payments than available so far in auctions of art or regular art gallery dealings, or on platforms like Spotify. A rather large number of people in the United States from all age groups, particularly young people, but also all demographic groups, racial, ethnic, national origin groups, more men than women. A lot of people in the US have invested in at least one form of the metaverse, cryptocurrency. And the discourse that comes out of their tweets and their posts on Discord and various and Reddit forums and various channels is that the metaverse is going to democratize their way to riches. This is not totally different from what the tech world has offered before in the early 2000s or even in the 1990s. For content creators, the slogan is something like, with payment in cryptocurrency and using smart contracts based on blockchain technology, you can own your labor. In terms of buying real estate in virtual worlds, the discourse is you can own your own reality. But this reality is also a means of corporate branding. the very same companies that we see on the highway in our countries today are the same companies that are creating stores and offices for themselves in the metaverse. But that has been transferred back into the real material world where we actually buy hamburgers and eat them. And I don't think this is going to replace McDonald's, but there has been at least one restaurant opened in Los Angeles inspired by that very same ape, and creating distribution systems around cryptocurrency and NFTs for real hamburgers. So I wonder, whose landscape is this? It's capitalism's fictitious landscape, but it looks a lot like, well, the production values of Ridley Scott's 1980s film Blade Runner, or a slightly dystopian suburban shopping mall. So maybe what we have is the same innovation complex that I showed you in the video, transformed into, or transmuted into, transported into another dimension. So we have the same discourse of good for economic growth, creating jobs, but entrepreneurship is now appearing as ownership. Own your work, get paid in NFTs or cryptocurrency. We have the same kinds of organizational spaces that we see in cities now, from New York to any other city where innovation is a goal. We have the city government, and in, say, Chinese cities, we have district governments pushing an industrial policy favoring digital technology. We have the same triple helix, in Henry Etzkowitz's phrase, of public-private nonprofit partnerships backing expansion of the metaverse. And we have the same evangelists promoting a tech community. And now we have new evangelists, creators of Bitcoin and Ethereum and other companies in this world, promoting communities online, backing an expansion of risky speculation. We also have the same geographical spaces where we have clusters within cities, like the innovation districts I've written about, but we have clusters of cities too, in these global circuits that are so familiar to us through the transmission of data, ideas, finance techniques. And we still have the same urban and regional hierarchies. So far, this is not totally different from what other people, especially geographers, not so much sociologists, have been writing about for a long time. And it's particularly similar in looking at urban and regional hierarchies to work done by the US geographer Matthew Zook with a number of co-authors. So we see, just looking around the world and listening to the discourse, watching who's getting active, 6 different levels, let's say, of crypto places. We have the usual suspects, the big financial capitals of the world, where the burgeoning field of fintech reaches out to cryptocurrency, DeFi, decentralized finance, and other metaverse activities. Then we have the lesser cities that would like to be financial capitals. During the pandemic, there was a certain amount of venture capitalist migration and tech migration to Miami, for example, so that the mayors of Miami and New York engaged in a bit of publicity invoking competition, very similar to the competition between New York and London in the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis. But this time it was the mayor of New York and the mayor of Miami, each one claiming that they would be happy to get their salary as mayor in the form of cryptocurrency. But also Cape Town, which has emerged as a financial hub in Africa, trying to create the bridges between tech startups, big tech companies, and financial firms that would catapult these cities into the top levels of crypto places. And then we have the aspiring tech hubs, for example, Fort Worth, Texas, which I'll show you in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Fort Worth, Texas, located disadvantageously near Austin, Texas, a big center of tech innovation, and Dallas, where there are a lot of tech companies. Fort Worth trying through cryptocurrency mining to create its own innovation complex and catapult into the list of cities to take note of in the metaverse. And then we have countries that in an earlier time would have been called enterprise zones, but they are now trying to set themselves up as digital asset hubs where capital can be sent from existing financial capitals, and that capital can perhaps in somewhat unscrutinized ways participate in deals for the metaverse. And then we have the deindustrialized places that are hungering for new economic activities, and they're located as in old manufacturing days, located near bodies of water, creating hydropower to give them hope that they can enter the metaverse production system as crypto mining towns. And then we have the crypto lands that are not built up, not developed, where real estate is being sold to investors who perhaps want to evade the regulatory regimes of the places where they live and work, or they want to create some escape from the troublesome real world that we live in. I like to take the London subway system, the underground, as an index of reality too, just to be fair. So I gather that crypto is real in London as it is in New York. But New York seems to be doing, paradoxically, considering our urban unemployment rate these days, New York seems to be doing very well in terms of getting US-based cryptocurrency funding. Fort Worth, as I said before, has recently taken a plunge into the metaverse by installing two apparatuses for mining cryptocurrency in the city hall to proclaim that this city has arrived in the metaverse production system. And then we have the state of Wyoming, which a couple of years ago began to make state laws to encourage cryptocurrency operations in the state, and has been the site of a new decentralized autonomous organization of investors who are buying real plots of land in rural Wyoming. To do what? I don't think they're going to secede from the United States, but this is another form of participation in the metaverse. again, for architects who may be joining us now, I thought this would be an interesting example of how one architect moved from designing virtual reality shows about his city, Helsinki, through outsourcing contract work on VR to Chinese technicians, and then becoming a real estate developer through another corporate entity where he and his partners are selling real estate in this metaverse that he has created through a company called Zoan, starting with virtual reality, moving to virtual land sold for NFTs in what has become the standard blockchain way. This architect came to my attention because his company, his real estate company, Cornerstone, is making a presentation at a co-working space, venture capital hub in Lower Manhattan, where you can go and listen to their promotional talk and sign up to buy a plot of land in their part of the metaverse. So I'm thinking that the boat trip that you took with me through New York's tech ecosystem is not so different from the innovation complex that I've described in my book. This is from Fort Worth. We have an urban campus, downtown revival, built around now the metaverse. And we have the same infrastructure that we find in New York and every other city that has got into the tech world. We have machines in Fort Worth. It's those two mining machines for cryptocurrency donated by tech companies. We have partnerships with local universities. We have partnerships with a tech business accelerator for startups that have already raised some capital. This one is a local branch of a US venture capital backed accelerator called Techstars. And then we have the usual local entrepreneurship and innovation council. And we have in general a metaverse space for local politicians to engage in a local industrial policy. All of this comes with enormous challenges, the same challenges that we have had with the growth of the tech industry for the past 40 years. And I think even more challenges based on the expansion of this speculative mentality. Do we want to encourage economic growth, which always involves some forms of speculation? Or do we practically mortgage our economic growth on speculation? Who is going to profit from this? Are we going to still have demands for righting inequities, improving diversity of the workforce? A lot of these new companies have very few employees, and of course they are geographically distributed around the world. Whose infrastructure is going to be built in the sense of the metaverse and tech infrastructure, and also in the sense of urban infrastructure? What is going to happen to our post-2020 demands for less inequality? Are there new forms, as I've suggested, with the risks that wage workers are encouraged to take and content creators? Are we going to see more ownership of one's product, or are we going to see more exploitation? The state, the government, which is hopelessly behind in expertise and lawmaking, how is the state going to regulate any of this speculation? And for those of us who are professionals, well, for sociologists, maybe it's easy because we're not usually responsible to anyone. But how are architects and urban planners and urban designers going to respond? Are they going to plan the next fictitious landscape of capitalism, or are they going to fight it? What are we going to do? So these are some of the preliminary thoughts that I've had. I obviously don't claim to be an expert on the metaverse, but I wanted to share with you some of the doubts and questions and challenges that connect my previous work on the tech economy to the new tech economy that's coming towards us. Thank you. Questions?
Sharon, thank you very much for introducing us to a very broad and complex landscape. Hopefully some questions will come in a moment. Whilst you were speaking, I was thinking, well, what are the spatial implications of all of this? And then you comprehensively went through all of the spatial implications of all of this. I mean, my own work is in rural areas, so I was intrigued by what's happening in Wyoming and why is it happening? And I'm wondering whether becoming a crypto land is a new sort of form of rural economy that we may see more of in the future. The whole sort of business of mining cryptocurrency is, I think, something that is sort of beyond me intellectually. I really don't know what it's about, but I understand that it's very energy intensive, and people are very worried about the physical implications of all of these things. But anyway, I'm going to move very rapidly to questions from the audience. I'm not sure, Vicky, if we can actually unmute people this evening and get them to ask their questions directly.
Yeah, we should be able to unmute people.
Okay, great. So I have a question initially from Nick Kaufman. I'm not sure whether Nick would like to be unmuted, but maybe we could try to do that. Yeah, here he is.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, yeah, sure. Let me just pull it up so I can not take too long reading it. So I went to grad school in, amongst the placemaking professions of sociologists and architects and marketers and lawyers, and getting trained up to participate in this economy that you mentioned in your book. And now witnessing the metaverse stuff, it's like deja vu a little bit, but I'm just watching people interacting on Twitter, and I see there's all these amateur creators making 3D spaces for these worlds, whether they have this artificial scarcity or not. There's different platforms, and I see one of them arguing with a crypto enthusiast, and they're like, the crypto enthusiast is arguing for the scarcity, and this person saying, no, the internet's about abundance, and we create all these things with each other, and we have nightlife and everything. And the crypto enthusiast is like, well, there is a scarce asset involved here, and that's people who make real-time 3D graphics, because not even the Hollywood industry, which is getting into this stuff, really knows a lot about real-time 3D technology, which is like, if you look at the meta stocks, like there's a collection of metaverse stocks on that you can invest in, and they include all of the real-time 3D companies. So I'm wondering how this labor landscape might play out in metaverse compared to because I see the same placemaking professions getting involved here, but I also see like user-generated content is huge on these platforms. And then there's a whole new fields of like people from the movie industry, people from music and other fields, and video games, obviously. So how might that mix into this? I don't know, maybe just going by what you know from your past research, like how do these complexes of labor form, who wins out, and what's the power landscape like when people are trying to jostle for who's making what and who's making money?
an excellent question to start off. The scarcity of labor in specific tech fields is well known, and that's why even at this moment, while some tech startups are firing people because I guess they've expanded beyond the expectations of their market and their investors, other tech companies are increasing their salaries. I mean, AI engineers get a huge amount of money, for example, compared to sociology professors, for sure. They get a huge amount of money, and tech companies are offering more inducements to bring people back to the workforce if they have resigned or if they're working from home, to bring them back to the office. So the salaries for the most desired forms, most desired and rarest forms of expertise, like artificial intelligence engineering, those rewards are increasing. At the same time, big tech companies rely on contract labor. Those workers earn much less money than the most favored categories of engineer. There are great aspirations in the breasts of city governments, my own city government in New York, for example, which supports financially a school to train ever younger students to become virtual reality engineers. So, although I think that the number of, and I should say one other thing, the number of jobs may be increasing in certain fields, but that doesn't mean that they are increasing all over in every part of the digital space. And it doesn't mean that everyone is equally rewarded, also because of the geographical distribution of work all over the world, and let's say the current migration of Russian engineers and others who are moving around. There will be perhaps even more competition for the jobs that are created. So labor, looking at it from a city point of view, labor is always the Achilles heel of local industrial policies. And I join your sentiment in wondering and worrying about how everyone is going to be economically sustained by new forms of technology, whether we call them metaverse or anything else. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I now have a few people lining up to ask some questions. So hopefully, Vicky, we'll be able to unmute people. The next question comes from Lucy Natarajan. So hopefully we can unmute Lucy. Here she is, yes.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Nick, and thanks very much, Sharon. It was really interesting. I love your video. And it was really helpful to see it as well, because of course, talking about this kind of new domain, which I love the idea of a sort of fictitiousness of it. And I think I relate to that. And I think, as you set out, there are real challenges with these new connectors to the global economy. And I'm just wondering about to what extent that we might be questioning the ability of this new reality to really fix that some of its inherent assumptions are just unstable in and of themselves. So whether it's to do with the ontology or the values suggested. So obviously in cryptocurrencies are unsecured. They are in themselves unstable and so on and so on. But I'm more fundamentally, what about just the idea of expanding, extending, speeding up existence, this kind of hybridism of third space? I mean, it's really, really interesting. And some people benefit from it more than others. I think that's the fundamental question. But also, I'm really interested in this idea of how far can we really be present in this new space? And if you are also thinking about that, just that instability of it, the expertise that we think we can have? Are we falling into that trap again of modernism, that we think we can do things better and faster and know more and sort of beyond ourselves? That's really the question.
Well, you have put forward the existential predicament really well. I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, we see people who have made great fortunes in the tech industry escaping to New Zealand during the COVID pandemic, at least from the US. We see them escaping, like Elon Musk, into outer, and Jeff Bezos, into outer space. We see them escaping into virtual worlds of the metaverse. So I don't know whether we should have in mind some sort of dystopian science fiction film in which the rich people manage to get on the last spaceship and escape the planet in the course of destruction, or whether we should just keep thinking this is another economic field. There are going to be investors, there are going to be workers, there are going to be the usual forms of exploitation. But I guess what worries me at the moment is this sucking in of ordinary people into thinking that they're going to become rich because they are going to be able to create their own niche in the metaverse. Now, it's not that I walk down the street and I see people holding signs, join my metaverse, but from what I see in online media, there are just a lot of people who have been willing to suspend belief and join this new bandwagon. So I think it's in the midst of war, in the midst of pandemic, in the midst of the gun violence that the US suffers from, there are these other really crazy forms of speculation.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy, for your question. Next up, Claire Collom, I think, has a question. And hopefully Vicky can, yes, here's Claire.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Claire.
Yeah.
Hi, Claire.
Hello, Sharon. Thank you so much for your lecture. And as you know, your work has really been an inspiration since the first year of my PhD. And so it's wonderful to welcome you at UCL, although we would have been a lot happier to welcome you in person. I was very intrigued by two expressions that you used in your talk. Space for and by citycraft was one of them. And the other one was new spaces of state regulation. And so I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about this and perhaps tell us whether you investigated how the companies that you have looked at changed the urban landscapes in very concrete ways. For example, by bargaining with city authorities to get favorable planning conditions, bargain between city government, they influence housing markets through their workforce, they lobby for or against urban regulations, and they are entangled probably with fintech and proptech in multiple ways. So could you tell us a little bit more about this sort of very real impact on urban spaces that you've talked about in your lecture? Thank you.
Thank you. All of the above, yes. Tech companies are keen to extract the best conditions for their economic functioning wherever they operate, cities, states, regions, super regions, and certainly I've observed that from close in New York City, where there have been constant lobbying efforts by tech companies spending huge amounts of money to try to get favorable legislation from both the city government and the state government, not to mention the US government. And whether you call this the the nefarious work of the platform economy or an older form of business lobbying, or you look at the permeation of government by capitalist interests. Whatever, you know, we see many dimensions, as you said in your question. We see many dimensions of pressure on government, which controls to a greater or lesser extent the basic factors of land and labor in the localities where companies operate. The capital, national governments, I guess, have a little bit more control over over capital, but there are many conditions that real companies have to try to bargain for, and they do. In my book, I quote a New York-based venture capitalist, very well known here in New York, who said at a conference, the tech industry wants a seat at the table. And he literally meant that, right? He wants the people from the tech business world to sit, whether it's Google or it's his venture capital firm or other firms. He wants tech people to be involved in decision making, not merely to lobby or to react to laws, but to bring, I think he's probably said, to bring their expertise into the world of the legislators and the politicians, to sit with them at the same table to hammer out the laws that they will then be subject to. So there, you know, there is just a thorough imbrication of new companies and their more favored workers, their richer workforce, and city governments and state governments in the US, that is really creating a web of obligations that will bind us, our populations, to future inequalities. It's not a very optimistic answer, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got some great news for Claire and Lucy, and that is that Sharon will be joining us here in London next April. So she wasn't able to come over this evening or this week, but we are arranging a slightly longer stay after Easter next year, where we'll be able to explore all of these things in more detail and make the links that I know that we all want to make. The next question is from Alexi Marmot. If Alexi can be unmuted, Vicky. Great.
Right. Terrific talk. Thank you so much, Sharon. I'm really intrigued by much of what you were saying. My question really is one of slight surprise. I come from the world of architecture and urban design originally, and my surprise is that some of the large physical centers where the architecture of a lot of the big tech companies that are so much involved in the helping to create the metaverse in their own way, haven't really been mentioned. You didn't really mention at all about the San Francisco Bay Area, for example, or the whole West Coast indeed has been such a center in the past of the physical creation of the tech world, and also the sort of Boston and beyond area on the East Coast. And then looking internationally, places like China, where so much, again, really innovative stuff has been going on. So I just really was curious as to why perhaps you didn't mention them. Of course, there's been lots of discussion about the fact that even for the big tech companies, they're now changing their whole concept of where people work, partly to save hugely on salaries, and moving to many more locations across the US, to cheaper cities, to cities where housing and commuting aren't as onerous as the centers that were before seen as the thought-provoking generators of much of the tech world and the metaverse. So, love to hear your comments on where those places are going, if they are, and perhaps why you didn't want to focus on them.
Thank you, Alexi. I've spent a fair amount of time in China, especially in Shanghai in recent years, well, before 2020, that is. I have seen, although the forms of government action there are quite different from in the US or Europe, certainly from the US, very similar features of what I'd like to call the innovation complex in terms of the partnerships, the physical landscape, and even the discourse of entrepreneurship and innovation. So I've always said, and I hope this doesn't sound too lazy, I've always said that if I write about New York, I'm reasonably sure from my travels and reading that I'm writing about a lot of other cities also. So I do think that other places are trying to make niches for themselves in the metaverse, as well as every other area of digital technology. But it seems as though an awful lot of capital is being invested in the financial capitals, as I said in my talk, so that, let's say, New York City may be doing New York City based firms, I'll get back to that in a moment, are doing very well in terms of garnering venture capital investment in metaverse activities. And the city government is trying to promote, as far as it does finance and discursively promote, areas of the tech industry, specifically cryptocurrency, crypto security, virtual reality, and fintech and prop tech, as well as biotech. New York does much better by the force of embedded financial companies in those fields, in the financial part of the metaverse and in the media part of the metaverse, than it does, say, in biotech. I mean, there's a demand for health tech and biotech everywhere, especially since the pandemic began. And New York City has been chasing biotech since the early 1990s and has major research centers in medicine and health science. But the physical plant for biotech innovation and biotech work is not here, still is not here, even though there have been a lot of efforts in the past few years and investments. So I don't see, for the moment, I don't see a change in the global division of labor between different kinds of places and the tech activities that they have developed so far, despite these aspirational cities and other places that I mentioned in the hierarchy. One of the big challenges to us, though, as researchers, is trying to figure out how the increasing use of labor from all over the world and working remotely are going to affect place-based industries. So that if I say, as I said before, venture capital is going more to firms based in New York City than to firms in Silicon Valley or Los Angeles in cryptocurrency, what does that really mean? These firms have their offices in New York City. They have their management teams and probably marketing teams in New York City. But who knows where the rest of their jobs are? What does it mean to a city to say the city is gaining venture capital investment, or to say the city has a big presence in the metaverse or anything else? And in fact, I read a couple of weeks ago that New York City has the most job listings for tech jobs this month. What does that mean? Where are those jobs based? I mean, where are those people living who are getting those jobs? Are they living in New York City or living, you know, who knows where? I mean, I do see a very strong probability of regional growth centers in tech. You know, the 100-mile city, as you know, was written about some years ago, where tech people have migrated to ex-urban areas near New York City and within a close train ride or auto commute from New York City, but they may not be living in the city anymore, or may not be living primarily in the city. So that we have these, you know, large, I think, you know, probably we are seeing the growth of large tech hubs that combine urban and ex-urban places close to cities. I mean, there have been a lot of people saying, oh, well, you know, in the UK, people talk about the Oxford Cambridge arc, but that doesn't really exist and so on. Well, maybe it doesn't exist yet, but it's in the process of formation. In New York City, I you know, could imagine a 100-mile city stretching from the Hudson River Valley, north of New York City, to the Long Island beach towns of the Hamptons to the east of New York City, or the megalopolis that Gottsman wrote about in the 1960s, stretching from Boston south to Washington, D.C. Boston and D.C. both being big tech places. So in terms of the material landscape, I see it getting bigger, but I don't necessarily see it becoming more equitable.
Great, thank you. Sharon, you've been really generous with your time this evening. We're going to pitch 3 more questions at you. Hopefully we can finish by past, but let's see. So these are the last 3 now. So next up we have Hee Jin. Vicky, if we can unmute Hee Jin so she can ask a question.
Okay. Yes. Hello. Thank you. Thank you for the great lecture. It was really interesting to get to know about Metaverse and its opportunities and the challenges. But sorry, it's a little bit slightly different issues. But for me, it was more interesting that you mentioned the waterfronts in New York City as representatives showing the city's new economy in your video. So I wonder if you think there are any particular reasons that waterfronts can be such a special space in New York City or even in other cities? Thank you.
Thank you. There has been a lot of attention to economic development on waterfronts from New York to Shanghai, London Docklands, you know, a lot of places during the past 40 years or so, despite environmental warnings about flooding and storm surges. So there seems to be an awful lot of investment in waterfronts, but not a commensurate investment in protecting the waterfronts from erosion, let's say. So, you know, the waterfront provides a lot of disused land, a lot of old manufacturing and warehouse spaces. And you know, once the waterfront has been reclaimed for consumption from old style manufacturing production, the waterfront offers a certain amount of natural beauty that everybody likes. I don't think the tech industry, I'm not sure, I've read conflicting stories about why Google wanted to locate in New York, close to the waterfront. Google started out in the early 2000s, renting a small office near Times Square, and then moved down to Chelsea on the advice of their leading engineer at the time. Either they wanted to locate on the waterfront because there was a big unused old office building nearby, or they serendipitously or circumstantially wanted to locate there because they figured that the High Line was going to be built and the area would become much more attractive. Or more likely, they decided to locate there because underneath one of the north-south streets was already a fiber optic network cable. So I don't know what the objective and subjective reasons are for tech companies to be interested in the waterfront, but in New York, there was a lot of vacant land. That's where Cornell Tech is. It's on city-owned vacant land, and financially less valuable land.
Great, thanks. So our penultimate question comes from Danielle Sanderson. If we can unmute Danielle. Thank you very much, Ejin, as well for your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay. So perhaps playing devil's advocate to an extent, is there an element of the emperor's new clothes behind the metaverse, in the sense of it being built on sand, built on nothing, the liminal spaces of the metaverse? I mean, I remember my kids playing Sim City, you know, young people being brought up on these virtual spaces. Will they get bored and realize that actually it's like a giant Ponzi scheme? And the exploitation, the mining of crypto, and I've seen people playing games to create avatars for the metaverse by playing games for crypto payment. You know, Nick's already mentioned the energy requirements of mining. So, you know, those externalities, will it become like a pariah? I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
These are, Danielle, thank you. These are thoughts that I certainly have had myself. And please do not do not mistake me for an evangelist for the metaverse. But we have to separate the financing of metaverse activities and technologies, which may in cases be like a Ponzi scheme, from the user experience. Your kids are digital natives, right? They've grown up with this stuff. And perhaps that generation is much more accepting of the products of the metaverse than us older folks who, you know, really miss meeting in person. And perhaps their comfort with video games and digital gaming, in fact, underlie the financial successes of the gaming industry and other urban industry that a lot of city governments are chasing. So I think that the more people are become used to the representations associated with the metaverse, the more susceptible they will be to supporting the funding schemes and maybe supporting laws that benefit the investors in the metaverse.
Great. Thanks for that. I think the very final question this evening is from my colleague Sonia Frere-Trigo. So if we can unmute Sonia. No, she's disappeared into the metaverse, maybe. Is Sonia still here, Vicky?
Oh, she's here.
Hello.
Oh, hello, hello, Sonia.
There I am. Maybe I was vanishing into the metaverse. Well, thank you very much, Sharon. Again, like all my colleagues have said, excellent talk. Very, very interesting. And I just wanted to, I mean, you have been touching upon these in previous answers to previous questions. I was really interested in asking you to what extent you think that this metaverse economy could be following different locational logics to other previous manufacturing, industrial, post-industrial economy. So previously industries were locating close to rivers, then they were looking for centers close to labor, then they were looking for centers of high connectivity, and now we're in a situation where that doesn't matter anymore. So I thought it was very interesting, that list of cities that you shared. So there were the usual suspects, as you mentioned, but then there were a list of other cities that were not at all usual suspects. And that's what made me think whether we're seeing here different type of economic geography emerging, and whether we would need to think some of those locational logics that we've traditionally studied about, like the decisions for industries and companies to locate in a place, and whether it's just about having surplus brownfield vacant land, if that will become the key factor for certain cities or places to become new metaverse economic hubs. Thank you.
Well, locational logics, that's a whole big field. If you ask people who work on the business side of the tech industry why their companies locate in certain places, they usually say because that's where their interlocutors, that's where their business partners, that's where their markets are. And that, you know, even though a lot of exchanges go on online, there still is a subjective value to being in specific cities. Like Paris still has an image of being a city for the imagination, a city for creation. London and New York still have images of being good for financial firms, so that we, during the 2000s, we have seen in New York the arrival of Silicon Valley-based venture capital firms and other venture capital firms that are located in other cities move to New York, and maybe their main headquarters, their main office is not in New York, but they feel they have to be here physically in some force. Spotify, for example, began in Stockholm, but opened a big office in New York. So there's both an objective, maybe market partners kind of logic to location. There is, of course, what the tech industry always says: we go where the talent is. I'm never sure how true that is, but they say that. So that means that every university town is potentially actually a tech hub. And then there are locational reasons that have to do with, as I said before, vacant land, but I don't think vacant land is a more important reason for location than the first two that I mentioned, capital partners and a labor force. And we, you know, in the short term of the past 10 years, the very same cities that have been the leaders in different parts of the tech industry have stayed the leaders. You know, maybe there have been 2 or 3 cities that were aspirational tech cities moving into the top 10, but in terms of the amount of investment, the number of companies, the size of the labor force, the same cities have, at least for 10 or so years, the same cities have stayed in the top tier. So I'm sure that there will be decisions that are made that change, you know, the positions of some places within existing hierarchies. But I don't see a tremendous disruption of existing regional hierarchies.
Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sonia, for the question. And Sharon, thank you very much for your contribution this evening. I feel that the lecture series this year has gone out on a high, and I'm very grateful for that. As I said earlier, we're going to see you in April next year. So there'll be an opportunity for many more people to ask you questions, for many more different forms of engagement. There's going to be not only formal events that we will plan and collaborations, but hopefully informal events as well. We're rather fond of those sorts of things at UCL, and I hope you are too. So thank you very much for your contribution this evening, and thanks everybody for your questions. Sharon won't know this, but in all previous lectures, I've been the one reading out the questions, and we haven't, or I haven't prompted Vicky to unmute people, and it's been a much better format, I think, this evening, for you to actually hear the questions directly and engage with people. And thank you very much for your engagements. So thanks again, and see you after Easter.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody.